Welcome. For those of you who have been listening to our introductory chit chat, thank you. Good to see, well, I can't see you, but good to know that you can see us, I suppose. And we're going to get started. We're going to be talking about Sawmill Creek Vineyards. We've actually tasted a few of these wines on the previous tastings. This in particular is a really terrific wine. We'll get to that in a minute. But I would like to introduce people and let me see if I can get this straight because immediately to my left, and I'm seeing if this works right. Maybe I'm pointing the wrong direction, is Heather O'Grady Evans, who directs our social media and front of house. Front of house is pretty slim these days, but social media is rocking. And then on over is Rebecca, our brand ambassador, who's joining us from her home miles and miles away. And below me are Megs Goodwin, assistant winemaker, and Kelby Russell, our winemaker. We've got hundreds of miles between us today. This is great, but inches apart. So, Sawmill Creek Vineyards. We were just chatting. Oh man, I just saw on the screen. I'm pointing the exact wrong direction. That you guys are over there. This isn't at all like looking in a mirror. No. Okay. So anyway, Sawmill Creek Vineyards. You pipe in a little bit, Heather, about the history as I go here, because along with working at Red Newt, Heather has a lot of things she's involved with. One is she's very involved in a deep understanding and interpretation of local history. So she's probably going to be correcting me. Anyway, so the Hazlitt family, as I understand it, I've known the Hazlitts for the better part of my life. Several of the Hazlitt, a couple of the Hazlitts, most of the Hazlitt family, who's about my age, I went to school with and have known for decades. So my understanding is that to the two brothers who are both, well, one's dead, one's alive, who most recently operated these farms before the kids took over, were Jerry and Jim Hazlitt. And they were two brothers, and they worked together on the farm. And when they started taking over the farm, they decided they didn't really like working that whole farm together. There's probably a lot of stories to go with this, but that's what they decided. And they decided to split it down the center. There's a creek that runs down the center. So Jerry took the land to the north. Jim took the land to the south. Jim's vineyard is what became Sawmill Creek Vineyards. And Jerry's vineyard is what he started a winery, and his vineyard and winery became Hazlitt 1852 Vineyards. So they've operated separately like that for probably half a century now, since the 70s. So anyway, there we have it. We have bought grapes from Jim Hazlitt on his farm for, since we started. And then actually I made wine from grapes on his farm for close to a decade before that, working at other wineries. So it's a really well-established vineyard in the Finger Lakes, pretty sizable. I'm going to say 80 or 100 acres, but it's a pretty good sized farm. And it's mostly vinifera at this point. He was one of the early people in the Finger Lakes to plant vinifera on a real commercial scale. And he did so with a lot of verve and vigor. Some people might have been planting experimental plots of some varieties. Jim would come back from, say, New Zealand and say, wow, I love that Sauvignon Blanc. He'd do a little research and say, I don't see why we can't grow that here. Then he'd plant an acre. So he was a real, very progressive in his just his willingness to take risks and willingness to really pay attention to the vineyards and pay attention to the vines. And as a result, was very influential in getting varieties like Cabernet Franc and Syrah, especially Cabernet Franc, and some of these other varieties other than Chardonnay and Riesling, which were really the only vinifera varieties that were grown at any substantial quantity in the late 70s and early 80s. So anyway, there we are. So the block of grapes that we're talking about now is, we call it the North Block, and then its companion is the South Block. And this is actually one block of grapes, and it's on the upper part of the farm, right near the shop. So it's probably at about, about 800 feet elevation on the highway there, thereabouts. And it's on a relatively flat area just before the land kind of slopes off to a fairly steep slope down to the lake. And talked about this the other day, and I've been pondering it since then. There's a few things that we didn't mention the other day. And one is the north part of this block is really different. The soil is quite a bit different. It's a little less heavier soil and a little less well drained than the south block. And the north block is the same, it's the same clone, 239, but it's grafted onto different rootstock. On the north half, I believe it's Catawba roots. In the south half, 3309. And now I talked to Jim about this, and it must have been 15 years ago that we had this discussion. And I don't actually remember whether, I've got to think that Jim made a choice for different rootstocks because of that soil break. It could have been that there was only so many 3309 and the rest were Catawba. I'm not sure which. If anyone out there like Jim or Eric or whoever, chime in.
One story that I did hear, which I'll assume is relatively pertinent, and it came from one of the family members, was that when they got up there, that rootstock was so well established because it was so old that trying to dig it out was just not going to be as possible. So they went through and field grafted. Yeah,
actually, Jim did a lot of that sort of cleft grafting, field grafting in that era. In fact, I bet my brother cut a lot of those cuttings for him, because Jim would come up to his house up in Hector. He'd go on his porch in the morning, and there'd be a big bucket of grafting stock and root stock, and my brother it was a real knack to it. No, not rootstock, just the budwood. Cutting a perfect little taper on that scion, sort of nice and thin, but not too much like this and not too flimsy, so that when someone went through, they cut the grapes off just below the graft union, well, just above the ground where there's a nice healthy trunk, and take a hatchet or something and put a slot in the top, sort of split it open a little, hence the cleft. And then take this budwood with a little taper and pop it in there and line up the cambia and then wrap it up. And so it's real kind of a fairly skilled process and very repetitive, agricultural process.
One of the things that, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, the advantage of that is you have this fully mature root system. All of a sudden is supplying nutrients and sap to these two little cuttings. So you get really a lot of vegetative growth so that the canopy fills very quickly. So if you're successful at that process, instead of the grapes growing slowly and getting a crop in 3 to 4 years, you can have a crop. You can have the grapes are pretty big after the first year, and in the second and third year, you're having pretty full crops. So that's why someone would do that. Anyway, I was going to say Heather, but I think you're Heather.
Nope, you're right the first time. The true advantages of actually doing that field grafting. The thing was, it was a really high skill set, and there's very few guys left who really know how to do it well. And some guys have contemplated going back to it because there was such a shortage of rootstock there for a couple of years after 14, 15, and then 16. So there's a couple of old-time growers out there who've started to try and pass that skill set along. But the most amazing part of it is that you can kind of jump ahead in time in the vineyard and be able to harvest a couple years earlier. And Jim has always said that was the biggest reason for him to do it. I mean, it gave him the ability to pull a crop and get cash in for that crop faster.
All right. Well, what about this wine?
Wine is delicious.
I know that the winemaker's down there. One side or the other.
That may kill.
Yeah, I mean, I love making this style of Riesling. I think it's always been, it was actually when I was at Fox Run after the 2010 Riesling Rendezvous, which I got to go out to. The first one I ever asked to work on was a low alcohol Riesling, for lack of a better term, which, wasn't really a standard thing to make at that time. And I've just always been fascinated with them. They're, a really beautiful expression. They're an expression that ages very gracefully, and lasts, really wants time in the bottle to open up and show what it is beyond just being, these aren't like sweet and simple Rieslings. These are really topped with acid and are meant to show off the vintage in a really particular and special way. So Red Newt had made these styles, with both the Lahoma and the Tango Oaks sites before I arrived. But in the 2012 vintage, we had a few different parcels from Sawmill Creek that we decided to, we always kept these parcels separate and made them as separate wines. But in 2012, we really doubled down, and I think we bottled 3 different bottlings from Sawmill Creek that vintage, North, South, and Fred. And it was the first year that we'd done this North-South split of this one very particular block. The North being this kind of German Spätlese style, lower alcohol, earlier pick, higher residual sugar, higher acid. And then the South block is for anyone who's had it, is a really lean mineral expression. So this is the second go at it. I think it's just aging beautifully right now.
Gorgeous. This is what I would call a breakfast wine. It has enough acidity for, does that sound bad to say breakfast wine? Are you worried for me?
People are drinking wine all any day, any hour of the day right now.
I always call this brunch wine. Lots of fresh fruit, cheeses, little garden party with your friends for brunch. That's a brunch. Brunch, breakfast.
Honestly, I do think that if you really break it down, and if you're going to have a glass of wine with breakfast, brunch, lunch, even if it was like midweek on like a regular, spin of the earth, as it were, the low alcohol style really does lend itself to being able to like just enjoy a glass and then go about the rest of your day without being like, oh dear, I need to nap now.
That's right.
Because, sure, most people could have a glass of wine with breakfast and be fine, but with this wine, you can have 2 glasses of wine with breakfast.
In theory.
It also shows off, sugar is a funny thing. By the numbers, this wine has quite a bit of sugar in it, but kind of as you taste it, it doesn't come across that way. As a matter of fact, I think oftentimes, maybe I shouldn't say often, but it's not uncommon for customers to come into the tasting room looking for sweeter expressions of wine, and we make wines that really suit their palate. But if they just went by the sugar number, they would think this wine is, right in their wheelhouse. And sometimes it really doesn't suit their taste because, it's not a sweet wine in the classic sense, right? The acid's pretty ripping. It's actually, in some ways, tastes drier than some of our drier, medium sweet expressions of Riesling.
Yeah, it certainly drives home that point of how important balance is in Riesling, much more so than looking at sort of abjectly at numbers of sweetness.
Yeah, and to your point, Kelly, it does finish bone dry and it makes your mouth water. You just want another sip. Gorgeous.
So you mentioned how this has, really racing acidity and quite a bit of sugar and is perfectly balanced with those components. How is that achieved, both in harvest, and then I suspect that there's some different ways that it's handled in the cellar to kind of pull this off, because it seems like it might be a real tightrope to walk.
Black magic, lots of black magic. No, I think the way that we think about our kind of paradigm for thinking about Riesling as it ferments, there are things you can do in the processing that set it on a particular course or not. And for a wine like this, we would kind of intentionally handle it a little bit more gently. We want the goal for this style of wine is a little bit more elegance, a little more clarity. The clarity of the fruit expression is very important. So where we might be a little bit, with our dry Rieslings, we might want a little bit more texture and power. With this, we wanted a little bit crisper in its expressions. But then when we think about Riesling fermenting, as it ferments down in sugar, all Rieslings go through different points where they really click in and where the flavors make sense and the balance point is just spot on. And then, they'll last there for maybe a day as they're fermenting, depending how fast they're fermenting. And then as they drop more sugar, they kind of get fuzzier and they kind of lose their focus. And they don't taste bad, but they don't really have an identity. And then, maybe 10 or 15 grams later, all of a sudden they click back in. And this will keep happening time, and they kind of go in and out and in and out as it ferments down to dryness. The trick that no one has the actual answer to is knowing when to throw the brakes on a ferment like that, and when to know that a particular sugar expression is the right one for that wine versus letting it go further, or versus letting it, or having stopped it earlier on. And a lot of that does just come down to intuition. It comes down to just how beautiful the aromatics are sometimes, and how natural the wine seems to fit that point.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too, it can be a little bit of, it's a difficult decision to make, because when you stop a wine, then, 99% of the time you've made the decision, you've committed, and Lord knows, hope you made the right choice, because in addition to like the fruit characteristics that really stain a wine, you've got a lot of transitory fermentation esters that aren't going to be really sticking with the wine as time goes by. So there is a little bit of crystal ball gazing to try and really kind of see where that wine's going to land.
Well, some of our followers have been unable to answer questions on YouTube because they don't have a login. However, they've been messaging me and texting me all of their questions. Guess that's it's a good and a bad thing when customers have your own personal information. So one of the questions is, we have always said that wines such as these, they can lay down, and these are wines that are going to age quite beautifully. But some of them have asked, how long? And do we have any other older vintages that are really at their peak right now that they should be drinking if this 2013 can lay down for as long as we have said it will? So how long can wines like this age? And then do we have anything that's older that people could buy online that would be perfect for drinking right now?
Yeah, I think my general rule of thumb with a wine like this, and I would rarely say this, usually I would say whenever you want to drink a wine is the time to drink it. But I feel like well-made Rieslings in this style, to drink them before they're 4 years old is probably a crime to them. They're just, they're just so young that you're really missing out on the potential. But I think after that, any time is a good time. And a style like this, especially a leaner expression like this within the context of the style, 20 years or more is not an unrealistic, is not even, that's not even a crazy suggestion. That's pretty typical for this style, and it'll just keep getting, it'll develop different characteristics. You might like it at different points. It's worth having some and drinking it. I think if I think about the ones that we have in bottle, and I don't know how much exist of any of them, I feel like the 11 La Homa, which was in this style, is drinking, if you had that in your cellar, that the last time I had that seemed to be really drinking at a beautiful peak. Not to say that it couldn't go further, but that one jumps to mind.
Yeah, I think another wine that's we actually have tasted recently, reviewed, was the 2009 semi-dry Riesling. Is absolutely showcasing beautiful characteristics right now, and that would probably be one to look for as well.
Yeah, and so the general public understands we've taken these virtual tastings, these Wine Story Wednesdays, and these aged wine Saturdays, and we're going to keep them going all the way till the end of June. And in the second 7-week arc of what we're going to be doing, we're going to be looking at some 2010 Rieslings as well, and some of those are drinking quite beautifully. But we already have the 2009 semi-dry available. There's limited quantities, but it is still available online.
Yeah, and all the wines we've tasted so far and these virtual tastings are on the website already for sale, so we can ship them. And then next week we'll be getting all the wines that will be on the schedule for the expanded virtual tasting all the way through June. So yeah, there's going to be a great depth of aged Rieslings and other wines that will be available to you, brought straight to your door by a man in a brown suit.
Uniform.
Uniform, sorry.
Or woman.
A brown suit. I don't know. We're living in farm country. That could be really taken a different way.
Any more thoughts on the wine itself? I mean, like what's in the glass? I think this is just so delightful. We've already said it's delightful and fruity, but just really it just kind of grows on you, grows on me.
I'm always impressed in the tasting room how a wine such as the North Block is not just the sweet wine that sweet wine drinkers enjoy. It is a wine that even dry wine drinkers will truly respect because of that balance. And because, it is that wine that the sugar is completely deceptive, which makes it versatile for things like breakfast, lunch, brunch, whichever way you want to go, and makes it great for outdoor picnics as well.
Yeah, I find it has some sort of qualitatively, it has these really intense types of flavors like pineapple and lemon and quince, but none of them are overstated. They're all kind of in the background, sort of stitched together. So even though it has these types of flavors that you associate with it being really intense, they're really delicate and integrated.
Yeah, it's a very pretty wine. Very pretty.
I think what I love about Rieslings like this and expressions like this is that I can also find characteristics in them that are not what I would consider like traditional like white fruits for Riesling. Like I'm also getting some tart cherry, and a lot of times you'll start associating reds with red fruit, and I think this actually showcases a little bit of raspberry and cherry characters to it, which is really just really kind of fun, different, and alluring.
Mm-hmm.
I like it also because you can drink it without having to have food.
Mm.
Every wine is great on its own and just so completely balanced without food. Some wines we drink and we think, oh, this needs food.
Yeah.
This one.
I've been thinking about how that particular aspect of the wine, and maybe a little challenging for us because usually we wrap up these tastings by saying what we think we're going to make for dinner to go with the wine. So I think I was thinking, what am I going to make for dinner? And then I decided that this wine is probably going to serve its function while I'm deciding what to make for dinner. Maybe with a little slice of this sort of moderately aged brie, and maybe just a sprinkle of kind of nice plump dried cranberries along the side, and another glass or two of this North Block. That's where I think I'm going.
Yeah, this is going to be a wine that creates inspiration.
I agree.
I had totally planned on taking this out to the front porch, letting the puppies run around, hang out, maybe have a little cheese and think about dinner later. But it started snowing here in Burdett. So I think we're just going to sit in the mommy chair, snuggle some pups, and have another glass of wine.
Very nice.
Right. How about you, Kelby?
It's still sunny here in Geneva, so I'm going to pour some in a stemless glass, which we call bistro glasses here, and I'm going to head outside with a ladder and keep hedging my U. So.
Well,
Yeah.
sounds like a plan. So I think we'll wrap it up. And thank you, Heather and Rebecca and Megs and Kelby. And thank you, all of you who are watching. I think there's 16 of you now. And thank you. And let me say it. Thank you. And
Translation?
enjoy.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.